Welcome to the Deep Dive Books channel, where we hope you find something valuable every day.
We continue our interpretation of Max Bennett's A Brief History of Intelligence. This is the sixth part of our analysis. Have you ever read Daniel Kahneman's famous book, Thinking, Fast and Slow? Even if you haven't, you've likely heard of a key idea from the book. Our thinking can be divided into two types. System 1, which is intuitive and fast, and System 2, which is rational and slow. System 1 often leads to mistakes, while System 2 is more accurate, but tiring. There's an interesting detail in Kahneman's book that not many people know about, and I want to highlight it. When someone engages in System 2 thinking, their pupils dilate. For example, if you ask a student to solve a difficult math problem, and they do it instinctively, without deep thought, their pupils won't dilate. But as soon as they put in real effort, their pupils will instantly expand, by about 50%. Along with a 7-beat increase in heart rate per minute, but the most noticeable change is in the pupils. If they think for a while, and decide to give up, their pupils shrink back to normal. This phenomenon is so sensitive that researchers can accurately determine when a student gives up on a problem. They might ask the student, "Have you given up?" The student is surprised, asking, "How did you know?" The researcher replies, "Because I have a window into your mind." When I first heard Kahneman talk about this, I found it fascinating. Kahneman didn't provide much explanation as to why this happens. In fact, he didn't delve into which parts of the brain are responsible for System 1 and System 2 thinking. Perhaps this was because Kahneman is a psychologist, not a neuroscientist, or maybe it was because we didn't have a clear theory at the time. But now we do. Many years later, Max Bennett's A Brief History of Intelligence also discusses the phenomenon of pupil dilation. As we mentioned earlier, the neocortex is like an AI neural network, sometimes in a state of receiving information, and other times in a state of generating or imagining. These two states cannot occur simultaneously. Here's a key point. When someone is in an imaginative state, simulating a world in their mind, their pupils dilate. This is because the brain is focused on internal imagination, no longer processing visual input, essentially making the person temporarily blind. Connecting these two books is one of the joys of reading. Since both involve pupil dilation, can we say that the imaginative state of the neocortex is what Kahneman refers to as System 2 thinking? Yes, exactly. In this section, we'll unify the concepts of mammalian imagination, Kahneman's System 2 thinking, and AI's model-based reinforcement learning. Isn't it amazing to realize that things you've been studying and thinking about for years are actually connected? Earlier, we mentioned that a new ability in mammals is the hesitation when facing a dilemma, simulating different scenarios before making a choice. The question now is, how does the brain decide when to pause its automated response and hesitate? Who gives the command? Let's first look at the brain's anatomy. In all mammals, the neocortex can be divided into two parts: the posterior and anterior sections. The posterior part is called the sensory neocortex, which interfaces with external sensations like touch, vision, hearing, and smell. It processes these signals and simulates them, responsible for imagination. The anterior part is known as the frontal neocortex, or more simply for humans, the frontal cortex, and it's responsible for deciding whether or not to pause and engage in imagination. More specifically, it's the granular prefrontal cortex, APFC, within the frontal cortex that decides whether or not to engage in imagination. The frontal cortex can be divided into three parts: the motor cortex, granular prefrontal cortex, GPFC, and a granular prefrontal cortex, APFC. Let's focus on the granular prefrontal cortex, APFC, which is a region shared by our brains and those of early mammals. All the decision-making and attention-related brain regions we've discussed in this series pertain to this area. We'll refer to it simply as the prefrontal cortex. Why is the prefrontal cortex able to decide whether to activate System 2 thinking, that is, to pause instinctive actions and engage in simulation? Its mechanism is actually the same as that of the sensory cortex. Just as the sensory cortex receives sensory signals, the prefrontal cortex receives signals from internal brain structures, like the hippocampus, hypothalamus, and amygdala. Notably, it constantly monitors the basal ganglia. As we discussed earlier, in reinforcement learning, the outcomes of reinforcement learning are reflected in the basal ganglia. You could say the basal ganglia is responsible for intuitive processing, making quick, almost instinctive decisions. In simple terms, the basal ganglia handles System 1 thinking. The prefrontal cortex continuously observes the basal ganglia, and just as the visual cortex models visual signals, the prefrontal cortex builds a model of the basal ganglia. It then uses this model to make predictions. What it predicts are the animal's own intentions. For example, if a mouse's prefrontal cortex sees that the basal ganglia are directing the body toward water, it might think, "I'm going this way to drink water." It predicts that the next action will be to drink water. This is a form of modeling. It's because of the prefrontal cortex's modeling that we have the concept of intention. In other words, intentions are imagined constructs of the brain. A mouse instinctively moves toward water, just as a robot vacuum instinctively heads to its charging station. This behavior is simply the result of reinforcement training, and has nothing to do with intention or purpose. It's the mammalian prefrontal cortex that insists on modeling these primitive impulses, providing explanations, and thereby inventing intention. Only with intention can there be self-awareness. This is why current AI lacks consciousness. They merely react automatically, without a prefrontal cortex. In the 1980s, neuroscientist Antonio Damasio treated a female stroke patient, known as L. The stroke had affected her prefrontal cortex, causing her to completely lose her sense of intention. Physically, she was fine. She could move normally, and understand what others were saying. But she lost all motivation, didn't want to speak to anyone, and had no desire to do anything. 6 months later, Elle's brain remapped a new area in the neocortex for forming intentions, and her motivation was restored. This case vividly demonstrates the importance of the prefrontal cortex for intention. It was likely a key inspiration for Damasio's later development of his consciousness theory, which we've discussed before on our channel. The prefrontal cortex and the sensory cortex are both part of the neocortex, and their functions are essentially the same. They simulate sensory input, build models, and make predictions. The difference is that the prefrontal cortex models the brain's own intuitions. Most of our actions are driven by instinct. Fleeing when afraid, drinking when thirsty. All System 1 thinking. The basal ganglia can handle these well, while the prefrontal cortex usually just observes. But if the prefrontal cortex detects a conflict between predictions, it gets excited and intervenes. For example, if a mouse arrives at a fork in the road, one part of the prefrontal cortex might predict that it intends to drink water, meaning it should turn left. Another part might predict it wants food, meaning it should turn right. This is a moment of conflict. The prefrontal cortex sends a signal to the basal ganglia, asking it to pause the action. It then has the sensory cortex simulate the outcomes of both paths, just like how AlphaZero uses model-based reinforcement learning when playing Go. Once the simulation results are in, the prefrontal cortex presents them to the basal ganglia, pushing it to choose one option, say, turning right. What Daniel Kahneman calls System 1, or fast thinking, is actually the instinctual response resulting from reinforcement learning, automatically chosen by the basal ganglia. What Kahneman calls System 2, or slow thinking, is when the prefrontal cortex detects a conflict, pauses the automatic response, and initiates a simulation to make a decision. This is model-based reinforcement learning. Reptiles only have System 1 thinking. Most of the time, we also operate in System 1. This is good. It allows us to perform routine actions like driving, walking, and eating without needing to think. We can relax. Only in moments of conflict do we need to call on the expensive computational power of the neocortex to simulate. The interaction between the prefrontal cortex and the basal ganglia can explain many phenomena. When we do something new, we have to think carefully about how to do it, which requires using System 2. Once we've mastered it, the neocortex can let go and leave it entirely to the basal ganglia. In an experiment, mice were trained to press a lever to receive food. Later, the experimenters added a substance to the food that made the mice feel nauseous. So, would the mice still press the lever? The answer is that mice, who hadn't yet formed a habit, reduced their lever pressing, because the action no longer had meaning for them. But those who had pressed the lever over 500 times, and formed a habit, continued to press it, even though they knew the food made them sick. This was because their prefrontal cortex had no chance to intervene, and the basal ganglia had completely taken over. Humans are no different. Many people habitually check their phones, even though it's often unproductive. That's not a deeply considered choice. It's just an automatic action of the basal ganglia. Moreover, all our intentions, goals, and the meaning of life are imagined by the prefrontal cortex. And it is these imagined concepts that strongly guide our actions. If you have no goal, you won't stay focused. If you don't actively remember what you need to do, you won't maintain working memory. If you find no meaning in life, you won't exercise self-control. These are all results of the prefrontal cortex continuously persuading the basal ganglia. Interestingly, the prefrontal cortex doesn't have higher authority than the basal ganglia. What it actually does is present various imagined possibilities to the basal ganglia, convincing it why a particular choice is correct. The prefrontal cortex is merely fulfilling its role as part of the neocortex, but it is responsible for imagining the big things. Another part of the frontal cortex, the motor cortex, is responsible for imagining small things. Very, very small things, like where the front paw should be placed at any given moment. Strokes commonly occur in the motor cortex, either due to a blood clot blocking the flow, or a hemorrhage causing a disruption. Essentially, a stroke is when a certain brain area loses blood supply and function. When the motor cortex is affected, a person may lose control of their limbs and, in severe cases, become paralyzed. So, is the motor cortex responsible for controlling body movement? Not exactly. The truth is, paralysis caused by a stroke in the motor cortex only occurs in primates. Small animals like cats and dogs do not become paralyzed even if their motor cortex is damaged. They can still walk and search for food. Why is this? Because the function of the motor cortex, like other parts of the neocortex, is also to simulate and predict. It simulates and predicts the body's movements. The prefrontal cortex plans the big, overarching routes, while the motor cortex plans specific movements of the limbs. Both are connected to the basal ganglia. In this diagram, the further to the left, the more it is responsible for higher-level goals. The further to the right, the more it handles specific actions. This diagram provides inspiration for robotics research. We need to break down tasks into big goals, small goals, and specific actions, with separate modules responsible for imagining, planning, and executing them. For mammals, it is precisely the elegant division of labor between the neocortex and the basal ganglia that allows the brain to operate effectively at different levels. OpenAI has not yet released GPT-5, but there are rumors that GPT-5 will have System 2 thinking. Based on this discussion, we can roughly guess what that might mean. You would need to create multiple agents to address a question, with each generating its own answer. You would need a mechanism, like the prefrontal cortex, to evaluate these answers, select the most suitable one, and then output it. These two steps together constitute System 2 thinking. To save computational power, you would need to determine when an intuitive output is sufficient and when to invoke System 2. Current large language models primarily use System 1 thinking, which relies on pure intuition. However, moving to System 2 is not technically difficult. The challenge lies in computational power. After all, it all comes down to the neocortex. It has taken us 3 parts to explain the function of the neocortex, but human intelligence is more advanced than that. Compared to mice, our brains have undergone 2 more significant breakthroughs. That's all for today's content. In the next part, we'll discuss the nature of politics.
If you feel there is value in this, please like, subscribe to this channel, and leave your thoughts or suggestions in the comments section. Let's grow together and read more good books.